Hi, I'm Daniel J. Lewis, creator of My Podcast Reviews. Stitcher is the #2 podcast directory out there, and you may not know this, but people can write reviews for your podcast on Stitcher. So maybe you know where this is going. You can now get your Stitcher podcast reviews emailed to you automatically through My Podcast Reviews. This does require a premium account, so upgrade to a solo or higher plan if you want to take advantage of this feature if you're not already a paying member. But it's really easy to use. Just add your Stitcher URL and you start with receiving your initial batch of all of your podcast reviews from Stitcher, and then you get them automatically from that point on according to whatever your schedule is for your emails. You'll see your Stitcher reviews right alongside your iTunes reviews, and you can see whether the review came from iTunes or if it came from Stitcher. This is an awesome new feature, and My Podcast Reviews is the first and best service for getting all of your podcast reviews, including Stitcher, automatically sent to you. You can also then log into the website and sort and filter all of your reviews to see just what came from Stitcher, or just what came from iTunes, or just what came from Stitcher and is a 5-star review, or anything like that. That way, you can thank people for writing reviews for you, which encourages more people to write reviews for you. And the more reviews you get, the better your podcast grows, because it shows the world that your podcast has buzz. I'm going to show you how to add your podcast from Stitcher into My Podcast Reviews so that you can start receiving your podcast reviews from Stitcher automatically.
The first thing that you need is your Stitcher URL, and the best way to get that is by going to Stitcher.com, scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, and click Partner Portal, and then log in, or you can go to partners.stitcher.com. This will have all of your Stitcher shows listed in your account, and the best URL to use for your Stitcher link. And you can use this URL if you're going to make a 301 redirect for something like myawesomepodcast.com/Stitcher. And I'll show you how you can use that on My Podcast Reviews as well. But for now, I'm going to copy this Stitcher URL from the partner portal and add that into My Podcast Reviews. So go to Add Podcasts, search for your podcast. I'll add mine, the Audacity 2 podcast. Select it, and then when I select it, you'll see this Paste Stitcher URL field, and that's just what you do. Paste the Stitcher URL into there, and then click Add Podcast. My Podcast Reviews will pull all of your international podcast reviews from iTunes and Stitcher, and then send the email to you after a couple or a few minutes. And I've sped that up here for the sake of demonstration. But here is my email with all of my reviews from iTunes as well as from Stitcher in this initial email, because this is a new podcast that I've added to My Podcast Reviews. The other thing that you can do is if you already have a podcast in My Podcast Reviews, and maybe you've upgraded to a premium account, or you already have a premium account and you need to add Stitcher now to your podcast, then the place to go is either go to your account menu and click Podcast Settings, or if you're on the My Podcasts page or viewing one of your individual podcasts, then you can click the Edit Podcast Settings button. And that takes you to this new podcast settings page. This is where you can add your Stitcher URLs, you can change the titles of your podcast, change the schedule, and other settings that will become available in future versions of My Podcast Reviews. You'll be able to set for each podcast here on this page. So for example, I want to change my title. Instead of being the full, proper title of my podcast, I just want it to be the short nickname of my podcast to make it easier for me to see in emails. So what we'll do here is put in the Stitcher URL, but instead of going to Stitcher, I know that I've already created a URL for my Stitcher address, and it's a 301 redirect, and that is http://oncepodcast.com/Stitcher. Add that. And once I add it, My Podcast Reviews will go check My Podcast Reviews from Stitcher, send me an email, and it will probably be very quick because of the way it checks Stitcher. And here are now just my Stitcher reviews, because that's why I just now added to My Podcast Reviews to be able to see Stitcher. From here on out, you'll receive an email automatically according to your schedule that will have all of your Stitcher and your iTunes reviews combined in it, and you'll be able to see if that review was left from Stitcher or from iTunes. But because we just now added Stitcher, we're seeing just the Stitcher reviews. If you go back to my podcast reviews, then when you click on the podcast, you'll see all of your reviews here for you to be able to filter or sort to your heart's content. That way you can see where your reviews are coming from, what your ratings are for each of these reviews. So for example, I can just easily see what are all of my just Stitcher reviews here, or what are all of my reviews from only iTunes and not Stitcher. Or I could filter this to see what are all of my 5-star reviews, and this will include all of my Stitcher reviews as well as all of my iTunes reviews. Filtering and sorting is a feature exclusive to premium My Podcast Reviews accounts, as well as the Stitcher integration. One other thing is that when you share your review online, if you've added your Stitcher URL to My Podcast Reviews, you now have a Stitcher button in addition to your iTunes button. So if you share this URL on any of your social networks or email this page to people or anything like that, then you're also encouraging people to subscribe to your podcast and write a review for you. And here are the links where they can easily do this. The iTunes link will open the podcast directly into iTunes if they have iTunes installed on their computer, or if they're on an iOS device. It opens their podcast app directly to your podcast so that they can write a review for you there. And the Stitcher button will also take them directly to your podcast on Stitcher, where they can subscribe or listen to it there. And the Stitcher button will use whatever URL you put into your podcast settings for this podcast.
I'm really excited to be offering this new feature. Remember, this is exclusive to premium My Podcast Reviews members. So if you're not already a paying user of My Podcast Reviews, please consider upgrading. If you are a premium member, thank you very much for supporting the service I'm providing there. And you have immediate access to this feature. Check it out at mypodcastreviews.com. And that's also where you can go if you know nothing about My Podcast Reviews and you haven't signed up yet. Then go there, automatically get your iTunes and now Stitcher podcast reviews emailed to you automatically to help you grow your podcast with word of mouth from what others think about your podcast. Sign up at mypodcastreviews.com. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, host of the award-winning show about podcasting at theaudacitytopodcast.com and creator of mypodcastreviews.com. Thank you for trying and using My Podcast Reviews, and thank you for watching.